Hello, my name's Dermot Trainer. I'll be your instructor for this semester for the US Civil War course. Uh, Before I suppose we get stuck into the history and to talk a little bit about the course, I guess I better introduce myself. Um, I'm born and raised in Belfast, in Ireland. In fact, actually, I'm speaking to you now from my house in Ireland, from my office. My passport shortly due to arrive, and I fly out from Ireland to Kansas on Friday, which I'm really looking forward to. Although actually I've been to Kansas a couple of times before. Um, Once 3 or 4 years ago, and then a couple of years ago. I've been to Kansas City. I've been to Topeka. I've even been to Pittsburgh, like in the south of the states. So looking forward all the more to going to Atchison because it's actually one of the kind of the big urban areas in that part of the world I haven't been to. But as you can probably tell, I'm not from around the states, and you're probably wondering, how it is that someone with my accent, my background, comes to lecture in American history, or comes to take such an interest in American history. So I suppose I should probably explain myself a little bit. And I guess the best way to do so would be to recall that I think I was only a child. I was only 5 or 6 years old actually, and I can remember going down to the city centre of Belfast there, just down the road, with my dad, and we were to see a speech by then President Bill Clinton. And then it was shortly after that, and I was very impressed. Like my dad got to meet him, and he was right there. Shortly after that, I think George W. Bush visited in 2005, and actually he passed by my school, and I saw Bush give a speech. And then I was quite close to where Obama was in Ireland in 2009. And then I remember I saw Mike Pence's cavalcade passed me by there a couple of years ago, and then, of course, who did I see not too long ago in the city centre of Belfast but Hillary Clinton, who is the current Chancellor of Queen's University Belfast. So it's actually quite hard to escape US presidents if you live in Belfast, which is a good thing because whatever you think of each of those individual presidents, I mean, I must say that I suppose I'm grateful to them really for taking such a compassionate interest in the Northern Ireland peace process. And it's not too far to state that, without American intervention in Northern Ireland, especially in the 1990s, early 2000s, it's unlikely there would have been diplomatic peace here as there has been for the last 20 years, which is great. I've mostly grown up in a post-Troubles world, and that's in no small part, in fact, in most part, really, due to American presidents who were able to mediate between Irish nationalists and often quite conservative British governments who, as you can imagine, didn't see eye to eye on the issue of Northern Ireland. So that's, I suppose, a little bit more would be to say that I've been lucky over the course of my years to have had a lot of family going back generations, going back decades, who have themselves emigrated to the States, to Texas, to Massachusetts, to New York State, to, Canada, Kingston, Ontario, and I've had the good fortune to go on quite a few trips to each of those places. So thankfully I've managed to get around the States a bit as well with all my family out there. So that's another connection. And then I suppose by the time I got to university myself, I was always interested in history generally. And then at Durham University, where I did my undergrad, I mean, you were kind of compelled to do a bit of everything in terms of history. But I was always drawn more towards, I was lucky I had quite cool American history professors, frankly, compared to other history professors. No offense, medievalists. But they kind of dragged me in that direction. That was great. And then I ended up doing an MPhil and then a PhD in American history. Took it all the way at Cambridge University there, and I've graduated now just about 6 weeks. So it's all, and then all of a sudden, obviously, I'm off to Kansas. So it's all happening really. So yes, I suppose that for the most part, explains all the major elements. And then I suppose I just want to, before I then begin with what we're going to talk about today, which is, I suppose, our first course, which is really going all the way back to the American Revolution, and I'll explain why, considering it's a course ultimately on the Civil War. Which is simply to say that But before I get into that, actually, I just want to talk a little bit about the syllabus that I sent you guys. What was it, a couple of days ago now? And which may have appeared to be quite a lot, so don't be too daunted. I hope. Um, obviously I've chosen Macpherson's Battle Cry of Freedom as the main text, and that will come in handy, especially for the latter half of the course. But otherwise, actually, I wanted to try and kind of diversify the reading a bit, and hopefully keep things a bit more interesting, as opposed to kind of sticking to a particular textbook, to be honest. And thankfully, to the best of my ability, everything I put on that syllabus, as far as I recall, hopefully I'm not wrong here, is available via the college library. And if it's not, just I'll find out, or you can email me, and I have kind of digital copies of many of these texts myself, and I'll post them on Blackboard, and hopefully they'll be easily accessible there. So yes, so I've put two different lists there really. So one is reading for I guess really each lecture week. What I hope is like a reasonable amount. Not too much. And then I've also then put like a supplementary list, as you may see, which I really kind of hope just provides you, the student, with a few more options to pick and choose from when it comes to writing the essays. And yes, I should say that I know the course is kind of maybe a bit essay heavy, perhaps, and maybe there's one too many exam, I don't know. But I suppose the reason I've kind of structured the course the way I have is, in my experience, it is like one of the best ways to get to grips with the history is to kind of, pick a particular aspect of a course and really go deep with it. And that's hopefully what the essays will allow you to do a bit. I kind of read and really get stuck into a particular topic. And then the other part of it is that I guess historians, if we're good for anything, it's as writers, and it's as the ability really of historians to take a lot of facts, a lot of historical information, and condense it and synthesize it in a way that's really sensible and clear. Because that is actually you'll find, kind of once you're out in the world, you're hit with information all the time. That actually is quite a good skill to have to navigate almost any workplace. So that was kind of my mind's eye there when I was thinking about, having a few kind of larger essays to be constructed throughout the term. And then maybe not so much structure it like a survey course. Basically to allow the student a bit more time, a bit more freedom. There'll be some weeks when you've just got a bit of reading to do, but then kind of in the back of things, you'll be able to kind of work away on these kind of larger essays. And then of course, inevitably, I'm afraid we have to have an exam or two at the end of term, but hopefully that won't be too bad. I'm sure it won't be. So I think I've kind of covered everything there I want to say about the syllabus itself, and if you do have any questions, feel free to just shoot me an email at dtrainer@benedictine.edu. And yes, one final thing, I understand that in the syllabus, or in the course catalogue rather, it's listed as the coming of the Civil War, or something like that, 1828 to 1865. So I hope you don't mind that for the first couple of weeks I've taken things back a bit, because especially the Civil War, if anything, is the heart of the Civil War. Might sound like an obvious thing to say, but quite a few things went into the Civil War. If anything is close to the heart of the one preeminent subject, closest to the center, it is slavery. Because ultimately, I hear a lot that the Civil War was fought over tensions between the power of the federal government and states' rights. But then one might easily ask, well, states' rights to do what, or over what? And ultimately these were, if you read any secession document or Confederate state constitution, it was the right of states to enshrine slavery in their laws for the individuals, white male individuals and white female individuals in those states to peruse. So suffice it to say that, I guess my course really, the coming of the Civil War itself, I suppose it's structured best with as a narrative strand running through each week. Slavery, that's as a central contending factor as we go along, and so that's why I've really gone back to the days of the Revolution, because it was here, obviously, at the founding of the country, after it simply being a colony of Great Britain, that the first major debates over slaves and what the different states were going to do with their slaves and what the slaves were going to do themselves were had. It was the first major debate over slavery was around the time of the Revolution. In part, that was to do, of course, with the rhetoric of the Revolution itself. In part, it was to do with things going on in Great Britain. And in part, of course, it was an inevitable topic because it was such a central tenet of U.S. life at that time in nearly all the states. And so it's also here, I think, in the very early days of the Republic, almost as soon as the ink was dry on the Constitution and on the Declaration of Independence, that you see in very almost in microcosm, but it's there, the separation into two sections of the country. You can see, and to really explain how this sectional divide comes apart, that ultimately leads to this massive conflict we call the Civil War, which is one of the defining events of American history, and there are many comparisons still to the Civil War today, and it's still seen as a relevant topic. In order to really kind of get to the heart of that and why it happened, I think it's important to kind of explore the debate over slavery in the early Republic, going right back to the American Revolution itself. So I think that's kind of just me giving my defense of why I've taken the course back a bit from 1828. I think it hopefully will give a fuller, more richer picture. And indeed, actually, yeah, that's the one final thing I wanted to say, which is that, as for the reading, like the supplementary reading list, it's really for, I've put, well, the reading list for the lectures I've put is the book that I think is maybe hopefully the best summation of whatever it is that we're talking about that week. But I put the supplementary list there to hopefully provide you with a richer, kind of deeper take on the history, and maybe with some provocative perspectives on the history that you haven't seen before, and with some primary sources, of course, thrown in there too. So I think with that, I guess I'll get stuck into I guess ultimately what is the topic for today. So today, actually, I'm just going to focus on the American Revolution, slavery at the time of the 1780s. For our Friday lecture, I think I'm then going to get into the 1790s, the early years of the 19th century, where I think you can see the split emerging even more clearly. So I think I'm going to bifurcate these two lectures for our first week. So yes, slavery in 1776. So an odd picture is presented immediately to the student of history up front, which is that at the time of the Revolution you had something between 500 and 700,000 slaves, which was easily 1/5, probably closer to 1/4 of the entire US population. At the same time, and not only that, but you had slaves in more or less every state of the Union, even in New Hampshire, right up in the north, right up in kind of where present-day Maine is, although you maybe only had a dozen in the state of what is today Maine, or New Hampshire it was called then. But in other words, slavery was from tip to tip. Yet at the same time, slavery was never less ingrained ideologically into the fabric of America. So it's this odd picture of slavery is at once everywhere, and slavery ideologically is nowhere, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So, whereas slaves were fairly ubiquitous, at the time of the Revolution, there was never a felt need across the United States for an active defense of slavery, and here is where I suppose the ideology of the Revolution itself had its first major impact, because obviously what was the Revolution? It was Americans, typically elite white Americans, males, complaining about their enslavement, with some justification, to the Empire of Great Britain. The Stamp Act, the disagreements over tea, tax, etc., etc. So, and again, the forming of a kind of individual American consciousness. And so on one hand you have that rhetoric coming to the fore, and indeed actually then in response to that, across the Atlantic in Great Britain you often had British imperialists who at that time were moving towards the abolition of slavery, never tired of pointing out what they saw as the hypocrisy of the kind of elite white males in the States, making claims about the need for further liberty and against enslavement, while they themselves often held one, two, or sometimes in some certain cases, like Jefferson, Madison, Washington, hundreds of slaves. Um, I think, as Samuel Johnson said, we hear the biggest yelp for liberty from those who own the most slaves. So that was very much kind of the British critique. And I bring that up because it was the British critique, really, their enemies, of course, which really first highlighted what was to be obviously the central contention of the country's founding, and the constant use of the word equality and liberty more than anything else around the time of 1776. Think of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and the most popular text of the era, which expounded on these greatly, and which was incredibly popular. And also, of course, think of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which was spread across the states. So never was there a greater onus placed on the value, liberty as an absolute and liberty as a value, and never was that more highlighted for its hypocrisy by the British. And the reason that's significant is because that the highlighting of that hypocrisy by the Brits really kind of made its way into the American national press, and that really led to a defense of that, or a response to that really led to the first what was obviously produced by the Revolution, which is that if you're going to kind of talk about liberty so much, how do you square that with the enslavement of African Americans? And so you see that the significance of the Revolution ideologically, in that for the very first time it actually produced published works which made an active defense of slavery. Now that might sound quite odd, because you think to yourself that slavery would in some way would have been defended, you would imagine, from 1619, but in fact from 1619, when the first African Americans arrived on the East Coast, right through to 1776, there was very little public discussion of slavery, of the morality of slavery. Now, why is that? I think for the most part it's because in the 1600s, first half of the 1700s, slavery was such an Atlantic way of the world. Every empire had slaves to one degree or another. The Spanish Empire, which was still grandiloquent in in Mexico and in South America, in Peru, in Florida, in the southwest United States, part of California, enslaved the Native Americans that they found on a vast scale still at this period, and in Cuba, of course, as well. You still had, despite increasing calls for abolition in Great Britain, you still had British imperial colonies in the Caribbean, which were very brutal plantations, sugar plantations this is, in what was called the West Indies at the time. Then of course you had up in the north, up in the high north, up in Canada, and in the Great Lakes region, you still had the French Empire, and they still, often though merely just as when they went to war with local Native Americans, not as an institutionalized practice, but there were some slaves still taken by the French up in the high north. And then, of course, the lands of the eastern seaboard by 1776, formerly owned by the Dutch, like New York City, different parts of New York State, Albany. The legacy of the Dutch Empire there could also be seen, in that the Dutch were the first main bringers of slaves to the North American continent. They were the first major slave traders, and then hensely, before Charleston, before Savannah, before New Orleans, as a slave port, there was New York City, or New Amsterdam, as it was once called. So you see that the slavery was prevalent all across the United States and in the international scene. So that began to change in the second half of the 18th century. Most obviously, of course, with the growing skepticism about slavery morally in Britain. Think of like William Wilberforce and the British abolitionist movement. And of course then you've got growing moral and philosophical critiques of slavery coming out of France, eventually culminating, of course, in the French Revolution, and that would have its own effects that we'll discuss in our next lecture in Haiti. It would have massive effects on the island of Hispaniola and Caribbean. But you've got, published in English translation and widely held. In fact, these works can be found in the libraries of James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, although I don't know how much they approved of them. But they widely found and sold in booksellers across the north were the translated works of the Abbé Raynal or Denis Diderot, who were these kind of late radical Enlightenment figures who made a kind of counterculture case that in fact it was the whites who were the barbarians on the North American continent, and it was in fact the Native Americans who were the righteous, and the African Americans who were the oppressed. Of course, I mean this led to kind of this led also to kind of, I suppose, generalizations about Native Americans and the myth of the noble savage. So it was it was still a problematic critique, but nevertheless, it was there in bold colours for Americans to read in the 1770s and 1780s. John Adams was a big proponent of these works. And obviously Thomas Paine, of course, wrote a public letter to Abbe Raynal in 1781, which was published across the states, in which he commended him on his anti-slavery rhetoric. Of course, the first work that Thomas Paine wrote upon arrival in Philadelphia in 1775 was a journal article in opposition to slavery. So you have then slavery everywhere, if you will, but the Revolution producing the first active defences of slavery. And here is where you see the first cracks in sectionalism, I would argue. So you've got these first major kind of pro-slavery defences coming from the southern states. Of course, South Carolina, of course, always been an early pioneer and outlier here. But you've also then got an unusually large free black population already at this time in the northern states. Especially as the Revolutionary War continues, most blacks who manage to escape as slaves or manumitted or become free go to the northern states, and they're very politically active. In Boston in 1776, you had a big parade of blacks in the Boston Common, which greatly surprised, obviously, the locals, because they didn't expect the local African Americans to also be advocating for their liberty, but they were. And so you also then have the beginning of the Freedom Petition Drive movement. So you've got free blacks, often former slaves, in the northern states, where there's less discrimination, and they're able to make petitions to local state legislatures in favour of expanding the manumission of slavery and in favour of further freedom. Now you might ask, well, why was it that there was slaves, or former slaves rather, in the north were able to be so politically active? I think the key distinction here is already in this period you have the North, which is a society with slaves, or that has some slaves in it. And then you have the South, which at this time, and I'll get into this a little later, which was already what you would call a slave society, where slavery was absolutely integral to the entire foundation of the economics of that region, and hence the settlement of that region. Indeed, large parts of the South were settled because there were slaves that could be imported to work the land, because increasingly they were struggling to get free white Europeans to engage in the kind of hard labour that produced the tobacco crop, say, or increasingly cotton, as we'll get onto. So already you see here there's slight economic variations between North and South, even though slaves are used in both. And so you also see then with that variation come slaves already having a little more freedom, and on top of what we call kind of foreign international critiques of slavery, like from France, the French philosophers, there is already, and Thomas Paine is part of the story, a North American equivalent of that, which increasingly critiques slavery purely on a moral basis, even though slavery still had an economic hold somewhat on the North. And really I'm thinking here of Pennsylvania and the Quaker tradition in that state. I think it was the first anti-slavery petition actually came from a couple of German Pennsylvania Quakers in 1688. First major anti-slavery tract by Samuel Johnson in 1700 was also from the same area. Again, Philadelphia and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine were obviously kind of major figures in the foundation of the first abolitionist society in and around 1790. And then of course, so you had a religious tradition of Quakers in Pennsylvania that was becoming more and more forthright, that every individual human being was endowed by God with an inner light, and that God made the nations of one blood. They use different quotations of the Bible, but anyway, an ever more progressive interpretation applied to other races, or applied to other peoples in America, Native Americans, African Americans. So there's you can see there's already differences forming between the North and the South, and of course this is increasingly then reflected as we go on with in state legislatures. So, actually, I have a full record of it here of, that process I've been talking about as it then began to impact northern state legislatures that were less dependent on slaves in this period. So, as an example, you've got Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1779. I'll read somewhat of a African American freedom petition to that state legislature. That the name of slave may no more be heard in a land gloriously contending for the sweets of freedom. So you can see that African Americans were often taking up that very same hypocrisy critique that the British used against their own state legislatures. Now, I mean, in the case of New Hampshire, for instance, New Hampshire actually never formally abolished slavery. Essentially, slavery just died out there because it was seen as having little economic value for the types of economic practice that took place in that area. So yeah, in fact, actually, I have it here. Yeah, by 1800, so that petition was in 1779. By the 1800 census, New Hampshire had 10 slaves, and by 1810 they had none. And so that freedom petition, kind of early, just after the Declaration of Independence, you see that then reflected. New Hampshire at the top, then Massachusetts in 1783. The courts there decided that the state constitution prohibited slavery. Actually, just before that, in 1780. Pennsylvania state outlawed slavery gradually, and we'll get onto that. Likewise in New Jersey in 1804. And so you see this process continue, even eventually to New York State in around 1790, even though New York City still held a lot of slaves. And that process then continued through the north of Europe into what we call the Upper South. So even shortly after Massachusetts, or shortly before Massachusetts, you had Virginia in 1782. Then further down, Maryland, 1790. Actually loosened laws restricting the ability to increasing the ability or making it easier for slave owners to manumit or free their slaves. For instance, like in North Carolina, for instance, slightly further down, you could manumit your slave, but you couldn't do it independently. You actually had to go to a local county court, and a judge kind of had to sign off on it, so you had to actually justify why you were freeing your slave. So you see, though, there nevertheless, in the 1770s and 1780s, you could see why abolitionists like the Pennsylvania Quakers, quite far north, could look down and say that, albeit gradually, emancipation was assuredly and firmly spreading into not just through the southern parts of the north, but into the Upper South, and even into the lower parts of the South. However, actually, if you do look more closely, you'll see that there are a few differences. So whereas the kind of the ideological points made by the freedom petitions, the moral points had quite an impact in places like Massachusetts, the state court there, the New Hampshire legislature, the Pennsylvania legislature. You'll see that if you look closely, a state like Virginia, which me bringing that up earlier might have surprised you, when it introduced its 1782 law, making it easier to manumit slaves. If you actually look closely, you'll see there in the law there was a rejection of the revolutionary rhetoric, and they say that they simply are loosening this law simply because large amounts of the soil of the state is no longer appropriate for tobacco production, and so because it had been, after generational use, it had been worn down, and so now increasingly you have tobacco planters in Virginia who would have used African American slaves are now switching to the production of, say, wheat, which is much less labor intensive, and therefore often a lot of these planters had what they called excess slaves that no longer made economic sense, and so they wanted to manumit them. And so actually you'll see, and the same applies to Maryland, that law in 1790, and even that court rulings in North Carolina later in the century, where the judge had to approve, also had to have an economic justification. So you can see already that there's still a sectional divide there, in that it appears that this kind of sentiment is spreading south, but if you look closely, it's actually, they're only kind of freeing their slaves not for moral, but for purely economic reasons or purposes. And so you can see already there's a difference there in the justification behind emancipation. And so, yes, also one other point I forgot to mention is there is also a demarcation line. So south of North Carolina, there is no change in the law making it easier to manumit or to emancipate your slave or slaves. So South Carolina, Georgia, not at all. And in fact, actually, you would also get the impression that slavery in this period is kind of the end of slavery is spreading all across the states. If you were someone who lived through the Revolutionary War, in 1776, most African Americans in the North American continent, in what is now the United States, were enslaved. I mean, the vast bulk, 95%. The Revolutionary War has a revolutionary effect in that the British, mostly as a military tactic, announced that any slave that fled or sought to help the British cause would be granted their freedom. This is fairly early in the war, and so what you find is this, and as we'll see, then this also has a similar effect in this for the Union Army in the Civil War. You'll find that slaves aren't just economic units to be exploited, but obviously they are full of their own initiative and have very much their own say and their own impact in this history beyond simply what elite whites, planters, want. And so you quickly find that over the course of 1776 to 1783, by the end of the Revolutionary War, something like 1/4 of all of South Carolina's slaves have successfully fled their plantations. Something like 1/3 of all the slaves in Georgia. We're talking about tens of thousands of slaves here, and this is in part due to the fact that at different points in the war, Britain had more or less control over some parts of those states, so it was easy to make a run for freedom, if you like. And indeed, actually, by the end of the war, as a testament to this, you had something like 20,000 African American slaves in New York City, Charleston, Savannah. Those were the three urban areas that were still enclaves towards the end of the war of British rule. And indeed, happily, actually, most of those slaves, former slaves, were successfully departed with the British. To their credit, the British Army organised their own trips to freedom, either in Nova Scotia or to other parts of the Caribbean or to Sierra Leone. Liberia hadn't been established yet at this point, but back to Africa if they so chose. Despite the demands of Americans, primarily George Washington, that all these slaves be returned. In fact, this was a major issue in British-American diplomacy for decades afterwards. The fact that these slaves had been emancipated by the British or had emancipated themselves with the help of the British, and their former American owners had never been paid. So, primarily among them, George Washington. I mean, other claimants in this regard were Thomas Jefferson. I think something like 30 of his slaves escaped during the Revolutionary War. Some of James Madison's slaves escaped. Some of George Washington's slaves also escaped during the war. So, you see here that the war itself has a revolutionary effect. In fact, there's not a greater exodus of slaves from plantations in the South until the Civil War. So all told, if you looked at this picture like as a grand picture, and you're a Pennsylvania Quaker and you're inclined to look optimistically on these processes, then you would think to yourself, in the 1770s and 1780s, slavery, albeit it might take a long time, looked like it would slowly die out across the whole of the United States, even if it took decades to do so in somewhere like South Carolina or Georgia. And indeed, actually, I mean, to get onto that, what fed that impression was, those Pennsylvania, those laws that we talked about earlier, and especially somewhere like New York State, Pennsylvania State, which their state legislatures had gradual emancipation laws. I mean, they were very gradual. I mean, for instance, in Pennsylvania, a slave was free after he had served, or she had served, his or her master for 28 years. Now, that could include if you were born into that family and then lived to the age of 28, you were then free, but nevertheless, 28 years, especially considering the life expectancy in those times, still meant that most of your life would probably be served in slavery. Indeed, when these gradual emancipation laws were passed in these states, they didn't apply necessarily to those slaves living often, but simply their children would only have to be an indentured servant essentially for a set amount of years before they were released. So what that meant is that, I mean, after these laws, decades, I mean, slavery had a long afterlife in the North. So you had, you still had something like 30,000 slaves in the northern states by 1830. Mostly concentrated again in New York State. In 1790, you still had 20,000 slaves in New York City. That figure remained quite high in the decades afterwards. Um, but even by other states which passed these laws, like New Jersey in 1804, gradual emancipation law. It was so gradual that by the outbreak of the Civil War, even though New Jersey was solidly a northern state, you still technically had 18 quite elderly men and women who, God bless them, were still enslaved due to the sheer gradualness of these laws. Um, so you find there that, nevertheless, that was basically what the assumption was going to be for the southern states as well. But to give you a little bit of kind of the difference there, earlier I referred to Virginia and how the economic interest dictated actually a period of slight slave emancipation. You looked at the big history of the war there, and it looked as if slavery was slightly collapsing in on itself. Whereas in 1775 you had a small percentage of African Americans who were free. By the end of the Revolutionary War, you had tens of thousands of free African Americans, making up something close to 15% of the entire African American peoples in North America were now free. So it had been a huge change, never as a proportion. Nevertheless, in absolute numbers, if a Pennsylvania Quaker found this out, they'd be quite depressed to know that for all the manumissions in the Upper South for economic reasons, for all the emancipation laws in the North for partly economic, partly moral reasons, for all the kind of first abolitionist societies and their efforts, and for all that looked as if more enlightened views were spreading. If you actually look closely, unfortunately by the kind of the later 1780s, you find that the pace of emancipation, the dark secret of all this is that it was still being vastly outstripped by the pace of more African Americans being enslaved. So for instance, I haven't talked about it so much today, maybe we'll get onto it next lecture a little bit, but of course the US Constitution, which was founded around this time, and of course there's a huge debate over slavery there, famously the 3/5 clause. And part of that, gradual emancipation sentiment was written into the Constitution. In other words, saying that the slave trade from Africa to the United States would be formally abolished or not allowed from 1808 onwards, once that year was reached, decided by the states. This kind of was following what was the trend in Britain, which of course was the great imperial empire of the age, and had a lot of influence. So this, in other words, but nevertheless, so from 1783 to 1807, the year before the kind of that law ending the slave trade came into force, really, I think 1/3 of all slaves that were ever shipped across the Atlantic from Africa to North America, 1/3 occurred in those span of years. So at the same time you had all this kind of emancipation going on further north, New Orleans was booming like it never had been before, with thousands of slaves arriving every week from Africa. So this is never mind kind of the natural increase of slaves on southern plantations. Especially in the plantations of the Caribbean, the sugar plantations, which was incredibly labor intensive, and where disease was more prevalent, and where the climate was even harsher. Unfortunately, the death rate was horrific, and so there's very little natural increase. But when you factor in the thousands of slaves arriving into southern ports, Savannah, Charleston, New Orleans, on top of natural increase, it meant that unfortunately by the 1790s, you had far more slaves, hundreds of thousands more slaves than were in North America in 1775, despite the fact that a larger proportion of those slaves, of those African Americans, were free. In overall numbers, slavery, the dirty secret of America in the 1770s and 1780s is that despite all the rhetoric on the top, underneath, slavery in the South had massively expanded. And we'll get into more of the reason why that is probably in the next lecture. Suffice it to say that, you know, in the 1780s, 1790s, when we think of the West, we think of the Great Plains and the kind of the Great West of the Mississippi, and the Wild West that followed the Civil War. But the first real Great Western migration was actually from the upper South states into Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. So it was in the 1790s and early 1800s that you've got tens of thousands of slaveholders with slaves arriving to settle those areas, and those areas proved to be prime agricultural land for a labour-intensive crop called cotton. And I guess the takeoff of cotton and the South becoming the world centre, the entire world centre for cotton production, off the back of massive amounts of African American labour, is the story that really begins in the early 19th century and really enshrines and ingrains slavery incredibly firmly into the Southern society at the very same time that slavery is being gradually emancipated in the North. But we'll get on to the invention of the cotton gin, Eli Whitney's influence, and the particular ways in which that migration took place in the 1790s a little later, in conjunction, of course, with the Great Haitian Revolution of the 1790s, which also had a drastic impact on Southern attitudes to emancipation in the 1790s. We'll probably leave that to the next lecture because that's slightly further on in our kind of double lecture on the early revolutionary years. So I hope actually I've covered, I think, kind of the major phenomena taking place in the revolutionary era here, both the ideological, the economic, the impact of the war itself, the international impact of Britain increasingly becoming an abolitionist empire, or one that at least viewed slavery increasingly as backward. And also, of course, the efforts of free African Americans in the North, and the huge self-determination by African American slaves in the South. Often they were just one or two generations removed, of course, often just one generation removed from their own transportation across the Atlantic. So the idea of freedom to these people was not far off. In fact, many of them could remember being born not a slave. And I think the final thing actually I want to end on here is that kind of is the increasing the difference between North and South in this period to do with slavery that becomes relevant later on, is the development in the late 18th century of kind of hard scientific racial ideology, or the earliest iterations of it. And you see this most prominently in the kind of the library and the musings and the works of Thomas Jefferson, kind of one of the most enlightened Americans of the time. And he has several disquisitions on African Americans. And it's interesting, however, that although early in his career he kind of believed in African American uplift, as time goes on in his writings, he comes to view African Americans as, quote, innately inferior in body and mind. And that word innately represents a critical shift, that whereas in past generations there was less of a hard racial edge, African Americans were viewed as culturally inferior, or because they were an easy source from African warlords, they were viewed as kind of prime candidates for slavery, but necessarily there wasn't a heavy racial ideology behind it, although of course there was always racism and racial assumptions from the beginning, but they were less baked into the cake. And so you see this happening now in the change of rhetoric in the United States, in the early United States, where for the first time, Native Americans are coming to be viewed, are coming to be called Reds. People from Europe who settle in America broadly are coming to be called whites. African slaves transported across the Atlantic are called blacks. In other words, there's just a broad brush colour painting now taking place, whereas in previous generations you often find that, just as people today, Europe has a lot of different nationalities, and they don't necessarily all simply identify as white. So then in the 17th and 18th century you had plenty of Europeans who would settle in America, and there wasn't necessarily a white racial solidarity between them. In fact, they often viewed themselves as quite different peoples. The same applied, of course, to all the various different tribes in the West African coast, all the different kingdoms, who often warred with each other. Sometimes some of their same subject slaves would be transported across the Atlantic, and they would continue their intertribal, interkingdom tensions on the North American continent. So, in other words, they wouldn't necessarily view themselves altogether as fellow blacks. And likewise, of course, Native American tribes, especially before the arrival of Europeans in the 1400s, didn't view America as one continent, or didn't think of it in those terms, and didn't view themselves all as one people. Indeed, pan-Indian thinking, or thought, or ideology, as we would have it, was something that really only came into full fruition after the American Civil War into the late 19th century. There's kind of pan-tribal alliances on the basis of the fact that they were that both tribes were identified as African American. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that increasingly these kind of quite variegated groups with their own cultures, their own backgrounds, their own geographical histories, were now identifying with each other purely on the basis of a shared skin color. And so when you can see that increasingly becoming primary in the definitions. And so you can already see there that kind of hardened racial aspect is also, especially in the writings of Southerners like Thomas Jefferson, is also creating now a sectional divide between the North and the South. Anyway, yes, I probably actually, now that I think of it, I probably should have given kind of a brief history of, a very brief history of slavery from 1619 to the present, or to the time that we're talking about. But I suppose in some senses I've already done that. Okay, so I think we'll park that there for today. I hope that's kind of been easy to follow. I know I've been kind of all over the place and looking at different aspects of things, but I know there's a whole lot more to the Revolutionary period than slavery, massive though it was. But because our course is focused on the Civil War, and so close to the heart of the Civil War is this divide over the enslavement of people and whether or not that is right. That's why I focus so much on slavery in this particular lecture, and I will do so throughout the course. Although, of course, I will go into the many aspects, also the differences between the emerging differences between North and South that weren't directly related to slavery, but had more differences to do with how the two different sections grew economically and spread economically. Okay. So thank you for bearing with me, because I know that this medium is not ideal as a first introduction, and also I know it's not very exciting because it's just me in a white room talking to you, or me talking to a screen right now, and so it'll be great when I'm actually there in person next week, and I like to try with PowerPoint use a lot more maps, photographs, visual aids to help kind of hopefully light up the period that we're studying and make it more interesting in your minds, rather than just me talking at you, which I'm sure can get quite monotonous. So thank you for taking a listen to this. I'm flying to the United States on this Friday, so I'm going to endeavour to put out another lecture on the second half of this era tomorrow, but failing that, I will at the very least put out kind of a lecture transcript or synopsis that will essentially go over the ground I was planning to cover. I hope that may be a substitute in emergency, a sufficient one for you. It's just unfortunately that the first flight I could get was Friday, and so obviously now that I finally am to have my passport back with my visa stamp, I want to get out there as quick as I can. Okay, so that's definitely enough from me. Okay, so hopefully, if not in another lecture, online lecture as it were, before Friday, I look forward to kind of meeting you all in person next Monday, if not perhaps before, around Atchison, because I'm going to enjoy having a look around town when I first arrive. Okay, see you all soon.